Ja, guten Mittag. Ich freue mich sehr, den ersten Vortrag dieser Konferenz ankündigen zu dürfen. Mein Name ist Janina Urban, ich bin wissenschaftliche Referentin für den Bereich Neues ökonomisches Denken des FGW. Vorletzten Sommer saß ich noch in einer Vorlesung an meiner Universität zum Thema Ungleichheit messen. Dort referierte der Dozent über ein Ungleichheitsmaß, welches im Gegensatz zu anderen Maßen keine impliziten oder zufälligen Wertungen von Einkommensverteilung vornimmt. Dieses Maß, das Atkinson-Maß, welches unser Keynote-Speaker entwickelt hat, kann die gesellschaftlich auszuhandelnde Gewichtung von Einkommensverteilung abbilden. Im Fachjargon heißt sowas dann soziale Wohlfahrtsfunktion basiertes Ungleichheitsmaß mit Ungleichheitsaversionsvariable. Der Teufel steckt in den Wirtschaftswissenschaften häufig im Detail. Viele Studierenden kritisieren, dass diese impliziten Werturteile in der Lehre momentan kaum reflektiert werden. Weiterhin kritisieren sie, dass den dominanten Theorien keine alternativen ökonomischen oder auch sozialwissenschaftlichen Theorien und Methoden gegenübergestellt werden. Dadurch könnten die großen gesellschaftlichen Umbrüche unserer Zeit weder verstanden noch angegangen werden. Sir Tony Atkinson hebt sich mit seiner jahrzehntelangen Forschung zum Thema Ungleichheit von dieser Masse hervor, indem er auf der einen Seite diese impliziten Werturteile hinterfragt und Alternativen entwickelt und auf der anderen Seite tatsächlich die großen Fragen unserer Zeit stellt. Er zeigt politische Handlungsspielräume auf, die andere Kolleginnen und Kollegen wahrscheinlich gar nicht erkannt hätten und sich auch nicht getraut hätten, diese zu formulieren. Sir Professor Dr. Atkinson ist a Fellow am Nuffield College an der Oxford University und Professor an der London School of Economics. Seine Publikationsliste reicht 27 DIN A4 Seiten lang, ich habe es getestet. Und er war zuletzt auch für den Wirtschaftsnobelpreis nominiert. Zuletzt hat er auch ein Buch herausgebracht, was heißt Ungleichheit, was kann getan werden? Inequality, what can be done? Und ich freue mich jetzt, Herrn Professor Atkinson auf die Bühne zu bitten und nachher mit Ihnen zu diskutieren. Vielen Dank.
So, Minister, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind introduction and for inviting me to address this first conference. But first, perhaps I should apologize for speaking to you in the language of Shakespeare rather than that of Goethe. I did indeed work for nearly a year in Germany, but that's a long time ago. In fact, I tell you that I worked in Hamburg at the same time as the Beatles were playing on the Reeperbahn. That tells you it was a few years ago. Now, my subject is the economics of inequality. A couple of months ago, the first-year students at University College London in economics were asked their first lecture to say what they thought the subject was about. And the person doing this created a word cloud, where the words, as you know, are shown in the size of how many times they're mentioned. And so you found prices, markets, stock market, recession, growth, but the biggest single word in the word cloud was inequality. Now that wouldn't have happened, I think, a few years ago. And it is the case that we have heard a great deal in the media about inequality in the last year or so. The United States President has described rising income inequality as the defining challenge of our time. The Pope has called for governments to redistribute in a new spirit of generosity. And as Mr. Van Treek spelled out, the heads of economic institutions like the IMF, Christine Lagarde, has said that inequality threatens the stability of the world economy. But what neither she nor other of our political leaders have amplified is precisely what they will do about it. They talk about equitable growth, but they don't really spell out the means by which this can be achieved. And that's the main reason that I wrote the book, which you kindly advertised a few minutes ago. It is coming out in German early next year. And I wrote the book out of a sense partly of irritation, that I kept being asked by people, by colleagues, by policymakers, but also friends, neighbours. People would stop me in the street and say, what concretely can we do to reduce inequality? And so I thought I ought to write what I thought are some of the possible options. And it was done in a spirit not necessarily of saying we should do this, but rather saying, here is a list of things we ought to think about. And the key message of the book is that present levels of inequality are not inevitable. We're not simply at the mercy of forces beyond our control. If we want to reduce inequality, and that's of course a big if we want to do so, then there are concrete steps that different countries can take. They're not necessarily easy, and many will involve losers as well as gainers. And we have to discard, again rather in the spirit of your introduction, we have to discard economic and political orthodoxies. And if our leaders are serious about reducing inequality, they have to move, I think, outside their comfort zone. At the same time, I should emphasize, I'm not trying to describe some kind of utopia. Very much influenced by Amartya Sen, I'm asking the question, starting from here, how could we move in the direction of less inequality? So I'm concerned with the direction of movement, not with where we're going to ultimately end up. That's something about which probably most of us have different views. Well, I suspect there are quite a lot of people, certainly in the case of the United Kingdom, who think that current levels of inequality are excessive and they'd like to see it reduced. Now, I should remember to move this on, and I'm going to start by talking obviously about, first of all, what I mean. What exactly are we concerned about? And I'm going to just illustrate this by a simple sort of household account. And I'm doing this because I want us to stress that while economists tend to talk almost exclusively about the individual earnings, wages, and employment, that is only part of what generates the inequality of household incomes, which is at the bottom of the chart. And that's what I'm going to be mostly focusing on. But to get to that, we have to recognize, first of all, that there's more than one person in many households, so it depends on who is partnered with whom. We have to remember that there are other important sources of income apart from earnings, particularly capital income, but also obviously transfers. And we have to allow for the fact that households have different needs depending on their circumstances. So I'm going to talk mostly about inequality of household disposable incomes. I should also, though, emphasize that while I should talk mostly about that and about the differences which exist between rich and poor, in terms of sort of vertical inequality, there are also important horizontal inequalities which certainly lie behind a number of the proposals that I make. One of them is gender inequality. I think we seem to have, to some extent, lost sight of that. In England, we had equal pay legislation 20 or 30 years ago, which certainly made a difference, but initiatives to reduce gender inequality have rather stalled or rather disappeared from the political agenda. Another very important dimension is that of intergenerational inequality, which I think myself underlies many of the problems we discuss in the world today. Problems that I won't refer to, but for example, like climate change or reform of pensions and so on. These are issues which are very much issues of intergenerational differences. So those are things that you need to keep in mind and lie behind some of my suggestions. Well, what has been happening, though, to the vertical inequality? The next, am I pointing at the wrong thing? I'm pressing, perhaps I should. Oh, yes, good. This shows, and I'm here not using the Atkinson measure of inequality. This is using the measure which has come to be widely used, devised by Corrado Gini many years ago, not specifically to measure income inequality. I think it was to measure the density of fish in a lake or something of that sort. But it was, so it isn't directed at the issues of social justice that underlie, I think, our use of the measure. And it brings out the obvious fact that in my own country, inequality is high, not up to South African standards, but the United Kingdom is very similar to the United States. And you'll see that inequality in Germany is considerably lower, not as low as Norway or Denmark, but nonetheless is considerably lower. So you might wonder, what is the interest of a book written in Oxford for Germany? Why are you sitting in this cellar rather than the sunshine surrounding the castle? And I think there are important reasons. The experience has not actually been quite so different as this first graph suggests. If you look at what's happened over time, going back to the 1960s, you'll see that what happened in Britain was not that we actually started moving steadily away from the continent. It isn't that the United Kingdom has been moving year by year out into the Atlantic towards the United States. Actually, what we had was a period when inequality rose a lot. It rose from the beginning or middle of the 1980s to the end of that decade. We had a big rise, and since then, the United Kingdom has not really gone up very much. This is the line at the top. So it's not as though there's a trend. And journalists often say, well, there's rising inequality. In fact, in Britain, there hasn't been rising inequality for some time, but we've had a big increase. And we're not the only country to have had an upward step like that. And that's where the similarity comes in, not in scale, but nonetheless, it was the case that, well, in the case of Sweden, the scale is much the same. Sweden, you see, is the squares, and you'll see that Sweden had, after falling, inequality was broadly constant, and then the Swedish one has gone up quite a lot. You know, Sweden, which would usually be at the bottom of my graph, the previous one, has risen up quite a lot since that time. And in this country, again, a long period, Sweden was the triangles, Germany is the squares. Germany, you'll see, was more or less stable for quite a long period from the late 60s through to the end of the last century. But in this century, you've had a rise, and these are figures from the German socioeconomic panel, an increase, about half the big increase we had in the United Kingdom. And there's a second reason why I think the experience of Germany needs to be considered. This is if we look at what lies behind the overall inequality, you'll see that the earnings distribution, as measured here in terms of what happens at the top rather than the bottom, has widened. And that contributed, it was about the same time as the overall inequality increased. But in particular, we've seen that the poverty figures, measured according to the European standard, have shown a distinct upward turn around the beginning of, or the first decade of this century. And the poverty rate is now running at about 15% in Germany, which is actually not very much below the British rate, which is about 16%. So it's what's happened at the bottom that I really want to emphasize, and it's one of the reasons, in fact, that I wrote the book, was I felt that following Piketty's very dramatic book, attention was particularly focused on the very top. There was a lot about the more exotic parts of the income distribution. And I felt there was a risk that we were losing sight of what was happening at the bottom. We were losing sight of the need to try and tackle poverty in rich countries. We seem to have forgotten the Europe 2020 agenda. I think in Britain we'd never actually remembered the Europe 2020 agenda. So it wasn't a question of forgetting, but we've never taken any notice of it. But it is the case that the European Union has its goal to reduce by 2020 the number of people living at risk of poverty and social exclusion by 20 million from the current level of around 120 million. So I think we've tended to lose sight of it, and that's what I wanted to emphasize. And I was rather struck when watching the IMF World Bank meetings with some panels that they had in Lima last week. And I was watching these. You might wonder why I've got no other hobbies as if than to do that. But I was watching the IMF, and I was struck when someone actually got up and said, "Do you know that there are 120 million poor people in Europe?" So some people are aware. And then the final reason why I think there is a commonality of interest is, of course, that both the United Kingdom and Germany are members of a wider world community. And the dimension I won't have time to say much about of global inequality is an area where we've seen progress in terms of the rise in incomes in India and China, middle income countries catching up and closing, to some extent, the gap. But we still have very large problems, as was underlined by the Sustainable Development Goals agreed in New York in September. So I think that there are reasons, as it were, why what I tried to say is relevant. Now let me just turn now to what I suggest in terms of proposals, but to do so by, first of all, saying something about the underlying reasons why inequality is now higher than it was in the past. Now, economists are often accused of being behind the curve, as we were discussing problems of last decades rather than the present decade. I think that's not entirely fair. Certainly as far as rising or increased inequality is concerned, economists are actually rather quick to introduce into their teaching and their textbooks an explanation of the increase in the United States, for example, in inequality. And the explanation was one based on the labour market. As I said, that's been the primary focus. And it was an explanation which, for example, Jan Tinbergen gave in the Netherlands 40 years ago, which was in terms of the race between, as he put it, technical progress, increasing the demand for skilled, educated workers, a race between that on one side and the supply of educated labour increasing on the other. And as he said, but if the increase in demand outstrips the supply, we're going to find the wage premium for skilled workers rising and the demand for unskilled workers falling. And that's a story which you'll now find in virtually every first-year economics textbook, coupled, of course, with globalization as a second major source of the demand for skilled workers going up. And that leads to the one concrete area where policies are recommended, which is that we need then to invest in human capital, we need to invest in education and training. or smart growth, as the European Commission refers to it. Now, that's something I don't take issue with, and I fully support. So I'm going to take as read that there's clearly major programs of investment in human capital, particularly early years, for example, investments, which should be part of any program to reduce inequality. But the reason I wrote the book was I felt that wasn't the only part of the story. What I want to concentrate on is the rest of the story. Now, why is it only part of the story? The first reason is that those forces of technological change, globalization, are not something which arrived somehow from up there. They didn't come from outer space. These are things which are themselves the product of decisions and changes within our societies. I'll just focus on technical change. But the direction of technical change and the areas in which it's taking place reflect decisions that were made by researchers, by businessmen and women, by investors. And I think we need to ask ourselves, first of all, the question, why were those decisions taken and how are they taken? And are they decisions which could be taken in a different way? For example, I can imagine a well-known supply delivery company, you can probably think which one I have in mind, deciding to install robots in its warehouse and to develop, as it's planning to do, drones to deliver the program, the packages, whatever you've ordered, to your doorstep. Things will arrive without any human intervention. Now that makes probably good business sense if you wish to be in a company which is concerned purely with profitability. On the other hand, it clearly has major implications for the labour market, jobs, and for consumers. And the argument I would make is that these are things which should be of wider concern than simply decisions made by shareholder-controlled companies. After all, as many people have pointed out, much of the underlying research behind these has been funded not by the companies but by governments and other programs. And it seems to me this is a question we should therefore address. How is the direction of technological change going to be determined? Which are the areas in which we're going to spend our resources? You think, say, about driverless cars. In the United States, they're funded, to a considerable extent, by military research, for reasons are fairly evident, for a particular purpose. The European Union has a program on driverless cars. And I think we should ask, why have they got a program on driverless cars, rather than, say, a program which would develop the increased use of automation in providing personal care for the elderly? It seems to be another area where we could imagine considerable use. And why is it being used to replace labour rather than to augment labour? One could devise technologies which would make people who provide personal service considerably more effective, upskill their jobs. So, I'm afraid the minister explained to me she had to go, but I think it's very good that you had the minister here for innovation, science and research, because one of the key things I try and say in the book is, if you're tackling inequality, it's not just about the Minister of Pensions or the Minister of Social Security or the Minister of Finance. It's about government policy across the board. And the Minister of Science, as an example I actually give, should be as concerned about inequality as these other ministers. So that's my first reason for not taking the present story as sufficient on its own. The second reason is that when one looks at household incomes, which is one reason I put up this little schema, it brings out there are several other areas where it becomes important to think about the sources of inequality. And it's these that structure the proposals that I make in my book. There are 15 proposals, and if, like me, you're looking at your watch, I'm not going to discuss all 15 in extensive detail. I will just say something about a few of them. It's quite right. Under these headings, trying to bring out the ways in which I think there is a wider interest than to peculiar circumstances of my own country. The first is taxation and the welfare state, which has been identified as one of the sources of rising inequality in recent decades. If you read the reports of the OECD in the last few years, they see the fact that we've gone back on some of the post-war settlement in the sense of cutting back in benefits, unemployment benefit, for example. We've gone back on the use of progressive income taxation. And as they say, to quote from the Secretary General of the OECD, the reduced redistributive capacity of tax benefit systems was sometimes the main source of widening household income gaps. So quite a lot of my book is concerned about taxes and transfers. The taxes are particularly about things relevant in Britain, so I won't spend very long on them. Just to make, though, one point about taxation. It seems to me that it's obviously difficult to raise taxes, and that to do so, we have, I think, to tell a better story. I don't think taxation has been defended sufficiently. And in 1919, Joseph Schumpeter, temporary Minister of Finance in Austria, made a very eloquent statement of why taxes were necessary to support a capitalist system. And I think we need a narrative, not to say the same one as his. And the particular taxes I want us to focus on to illustrate that is the taxation of the transfer of wealth between generations. And the narrative I think we should tell is one to do with inequality of opportunity. I see you've got a meeting on Chancenungleichheit quite soon. Inequality of opportunity is something which most people favour. Equality of opportunity they favour. So, and other people here actually say, I'm not in favour of that. And most people say that they're in favour of a level playing field. But of course, to get a level playing field, one of the reasons why the playing field is very unlevel at present is the differences in inherited material wealth. It's also inherited human wealth, but inherited material wealth is a source of considerable inequality in the sense that most people inherit relatively little and some people inherit very large amounts. So I think the story one has to tell about wealth transfer taxes is as a way of achieving a more level playing field. Now, of course, in this country you have an inheritance tax, which is a first step in that direction. We have a tax on giving rather than a tax on receiving. So I think you've got it right in that sense. But it's not a cumulative tax over everything received during your lifetime, which is what I'd like to see. So you could go further to level the playing field, because the playing field, the unevenness, is measured by how much people receive over the course of their lifetime from different relatives, not just from one particular source. And I'd underline this role of the tax by using the revenue explicitly to, in fact, equalize the playing field by using the revenue to make a payment to everyone on reaching a certain age, possibly 18, possibly 21, some age like that, to receive a negative tax payment, a minimum capital sum, proposed by Thomas Paine in 1797. That would, I think, serve to underline, and it would be an easier, not necessarily easy, but easier political story to tell, since many people, I think, are in fact interested in what happens to the next generation. And this will be a way of making this a communal rather than a private, rather than individual way of transfer. On the transfer side, I want to make really 2 points. One is that I'm a completely unreconstructed defender of child benefit. That is that, and if I think an important part of our social transfer system is paying what is effectively a basic income for children. That is, every family should receive, for every child, a cash sum not related to income, possibly taxed, so it may be targeted in that sense. And I've certainly advocated, in the case of Britain, that we should increase, we've let child benefit fall, we should increase it. And I think it's also, though, there's clearly, I think, scope for an important European initiative here, that if the European Union wishes to take steps, which it can do under subsidiarity in terms of social transfers, that it can have a scheme which would require countries to provide minimum child benefit. It would allow countries to choose the method. For example, some of it may be in kind rather than cash and so on. There are all sorts of variations that could be allowed. But nonetheless, it seems to me if it was guaranteeing that every child in the European Union would receive a minimum amount related to income in their particular country, that would be, I think, an important signal, in addition to, of course, to being quite a significant way of contributing to reducing the extent of financial poverty and therefore meeting the Europe 2020 objective. It also, I should say, would contribute to gender inequality being reduced, because in the UK, I think probably in other countries, child benefit is paid to the mother unless they decide to transfer it to the father. And it's one of the few legitimate ways of having positive discrimination. Now, basic income is also the route it seems to me we should go in terms of adults as well. And so in the book I discuss my version of what I think you would call here a Grundeinkommen, is that right? But I won't go into that because it may come up in questions and my time is running down. And because I want to stress that while I've spent some time on taxes and transfers, I think in fact that taxes and transfers are only part of a program to reduce inequality. It seems to me we need also to focus on market incomes. Now, market incomes means, first of all, talking about unemployment. I heard on the radio as I was coming this morning that the unemployment rate is now lower than it has been for, I think they said 24 years, something like that. So clearly there's been a remarkable reduction in unemployment. It's come down in the United Kingdom too. But if you look at these graphs they show, it's interesting, they tend to stop. They go, it shows 10% down to 4% or something, and they don't show anything below about 4%. And we've lost sight of the fact that there was a time after the war, the time when I was a student, when the unemployment rate was about 1%, under 1% quite often. I think that we need to perhaps readjust our expectations. And it's something, again, which Amartya Sen has stressed. He said how it is strange how Europe is, in fact, so tolerant of levels of unemployment, of overall, of course, in the EU of approaching 10%. So the first thing I think we should do is to raise the profile of that and to make unemployment a target of macroeconomic policy as much as inflation. Now, some countries do this, or at least one country does this, or two countries. One is the United States, because the Federal Reserve has to have regard for employment, and the other is another country, but maybe more in the European Union, but one country which has an explicit unemployment target. They want to be among the lowest three countries in terms of unemployment, which is an interesting form of country competition. You can guess which country that is? It's Sweden. It's got some way to go at the moment. So, first of all is employment. But of course, how are we going to do this? We've been trying to reduce unemployment for about 20 or 30 years. And I think that we've failed because we've focused almost exclusively on the supply side of the labour market and not looked enough at the demand side. And in the book, I spend some time discussing the role of employers, the role of the demand side, and make the concrete suggestion, which you'll see there, that the government, in fact, should provide a guarantee of employment. We've actually already got, for young people, a guarantee. There's the EU Youth Guarantee, which does, in fact, if it's implemented by member states, offer everyone the chance of a job, training, apprenticeship, or further education. But of course, countries differ in how far they've actually implemented that. But I think there's no doubt that if our banks and financial institutions are regarded as too important to be allowed to fail, so I think the same kind of guarantees should be available to our citizens. But jobs are, of course, only part of the story. And I was interested in your reference to the hamburger appel. And of course, we've seen wages at the bottom of the distribution in Germany falling. The economists got what they wanted. We've now got a serious problem of in-work poverty. Half the people in the European Union finding employment in, I think it was 2010 or thereabouts, only half of them earned enough to be above the poverty line. So there's a serious problem of in-work poverty, and that's why issues like the minimum wage, living wage, and so on are important. And then I'll move briefly on to talk about capital. You referred to Thomas Piketty's book called Capital in the 21st Century. I think he actually should have distinguished more between capital and wealth. Much of his book was about wealth, in fact. And wealth has seen a dramatic change. And I was talking to a journalist from the Kölner Anzeiger yesterday, and he said, well, have we gone back to situations like 100 years ago? And I said, no, we clearly haven't. I mean, wealth in the United Kingdom, and most people 100 years ago had no wealth. As someone once said that, I mean, the typical person carried their possessions on their back, more or less. I mean, they didn't own their own house, they hadn't got a garage with a car in it, they hadn't got much consumer durables, they hadn't got a pension, they hadn't got much in the way of small savings. That's all changed. I mean, popular wealth is now much more important. And the distribution of wealth is much less unequal. The top 1% have more than their share, but it's not 60 or 70% of the wealth, it's now more like 20 or 30% of the wealth. But that change in the distribution of wealth, in the ownership of wealth, has not actually led necessarily to a corresponding change in the distribution of control over the resources represented by that wealth. Now, that's most obvious, say, in the case of pensions. Many people, less in this country, but more in the Netherlands or the UK or Switzerland, have private pensions. Those pensions are funded. Those funds are invested in shares of companies, so that the pensioners, the future pensioners, are the beneficial owners. But they have no say in the operation of the companies. So my pension fund's second biggest holding is in HSBC Bank. HSBC Bank are making important decisions, like, for example, whether they should move their headquarters from London to somewhere in the Far East. I own a little tiny bit of that bank, but I have no say in whether that decision is taken, So the question of control and the rebalancing of control is something which I spend quite a lot of time discussing. And as you see there are all sorts of measures that can be taken. For example, whole areas to do with the control of industry, competition policy is something which has profound distributional consequences, but at the moment they're not taken into account. So things like takeovers of banks, for example, don't discuss important questions about, for example, whether it will leave certain parts of the country without access to a bank, which is an important issue for consumers and households. And of course, at the moment, a classic example of the imbalance of power in the decision-making process is the negotiations about the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which will have profound consequences for everyone, workers, consumers. That's being negotiated between companies and, I was going to say governments, but I don't think most national governments are much involved in the negotiations. It's between the European Commission and so on. So that's an example of how one needs to look at the implications of inequality as well as the beneficial effects of owning wealth. So I've discussed a few of my proposals. Is the battery running down or something? I keep pressing it. Gosh. Ah, good, okay. I'll go quickly on. There. Ah, good, okay. So, I'm coming just to the end. First of all, the kind of things I discuss may be taken as completely off the wall. The New Yorker had a nice piece in March about my book, and they said, "Oh, it's all very interesting what you say, but it's for you over there. I know, it's for you Europeans. It won't play on Broadway. I mean, this is not any good for the Americans." Which shows how short memories are, because in 1978, the US Congress, bipartisan, passed the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, which, among other provisions, with full employment clearly being the objective, one of the provisions allowed the President of the United States to create a reservoir of public employment, public jobs. They seem to have forgotten that the Republican Senator Sherman, who moved the antitrust legislation, did so because he said, quote, "Nothing was more threatening than the inequality of condition of wealth." And they seem to have forgotten that Thomas Paine was in America when he proposed having a minimum inheritance. So, as I said, there are people, in some cases, many of the things I've suggested are not new and have been suggested in the past. Now, the last thing I want to say is I've talked about issues or proposals, many of which are directed at national governments and about supranational governments, the European Union. But I think it's very important to remember that many of the things also are areas where both lower levels of government can be important and non-government can be important. And lower levels of government, I see you're going to, section in a moment is going to be about the Land. There are clearly many issues, for example, issues in terms of measures to encourage innovation, measures to encourage local employment. In the US, local governments have introduced minimum wages, for example. There are clearly areas where lower levels of government can play an important role. And indeed, it's not just government. Employers play a very important role. And one of the features of the Living Wage campaign in Britain was that this is actually agreed by employers. It's not legislated. It's employers volunteer to sign up to it. And you may have noticed here, Living Wage, UK Premier League football clubs. Chelsea signed up a few months ago. Now, you may say it's led to their abysmal performance since then, but they've agreed to pay a living wage. A living wage, I should say, of course, is raising the bottom. It doesn't say anything about reducing the top, so in the case of football clubs. But that's an example where employers much more generally, many of the issues to do with employment prospects, to do with the effect of minimum wages and other things, depend on the time horizon that employers take in making their decisions. And I think that one of the sources of the problems we have in the labour market in recent decades has been that firms and employers have increasingly taken a short-term approach to their investments and to their investments in their employees. Workers clearly, again, are not just passive instruments. and nor are consumers. And I think one of the things which perhaps in the last few years has become more evident is the power which consumers can bring to bear. We've seen it in the case of tax compliance, and I think we've seen it to some extent in the issues like the living wage and pay differentials. And of course, finally, voters. And the last point I want to make is that one thing that we can all do is what in English is described as holding the feet of our politicians to the fire. I said at the beginning that if we want to reduce inequality, there are things we can do. But in one respect, I've already referred to it, we have actually agreed that we want to do something. And that is in the Europe 2020 agenda. Our leaders signed up, all member states, to that agenda, and I think we should be held to account. Quite a number of my proposals, I mentioned the child basic income, for example, are directed to that goal. And our leaders, I think, should be asked, if they don't like those proposals, what do they plan to do? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Vielen Dank für den Vortrag. Wir haben jetzt noch eine kleine Diskussionsrunde beziehungsweise Fragen oder Kommentare aus dem Publikum. Ich würde ganz gerne immer 3 ungefähr nehmen und dann kann Herr Atkinson darauf antworten. Ja.
This one.
Ja.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Is it working? Yes, okay. Then I'll take the opportunity to ask a question. My name is Andrew Watt. I'm the deputy head of the IMK Research Institute here in Düsseldorf. Professor Atkinson, perhaps I can pick up where you left off and ask you a question about Europe. What your view is of developments in Europe. I mean, I think for many progressive economists and for many people generally, Europe was seen as a way to shield also the vulnerable in society from the pressures of globalization. I think there was a lot of optimism also about the convergence within Europe, bringing up some of the poorer countries in Southern Europe and in Eastern Europe. And now we see both in terms of real outcomes, a serious move away from convergence and arguably towards divergence because of the crisis of the euro. And perhaps more worryingly, I would say insidiously, I think we're seeing a lot of skepticism on the part of the very same people who supported this process about whether Europe is not so much protecting people and creating policy space for the sort of proposals that you're making, but actually opening us up to a sort of race to the bottom situation within the European Union itself. And I'd be very interested to hear your views on that. Thank you very much.
Since that's a very specific question, shall I answer that? I think, indeed, there are reasons to be very concerned. In a way, European, what I might call the social dimension of Europe, goes through sort of ups and downs. I like to remind my fellow countrymen that when we joined in 1974, the European Union, European communities, had just at that point announced a clear statement of their intention to form a European economic and social union. So we actually joined something which was already with that ambition. We then saw, as it were, with the emphasis on the internal market and the euro, a decline in interest. But there was still at that time, in around about the 80s, there was the beginning of the Delors period, certainly. Delors was the first person to talk about poverty in Europe in a serious way. And indeed, that was a time when many countries were not admitting that they had poverty. And I think that's led to a much wider appreciation throughout the European Union of the issue. And the same thing happened sort of upturn at the time we agreed to the first program, 2000-2010, when the social indicators were brought in, and when, for example, the European Union was doing studies of child poverty, which I've heard one minister from one country say, oh, there isn't such a thing as child poverty in my country. And they're now publishing regular figures showing that it is a serious problem. So I think there are ups and downs. I think that the problem is one which is actually not to do with the European Union so much as to do with the divorce, and this goes back to some of the things with which the conference was open, the divorce between macroeconomic policy on the one hand and social policy on the other. And that's a divorce which I think would apply to my country if we were in or out of the European Union. So it's, I think that what we have to do is to try and resolve that difficulty, but it's not a peculiarly European one. But it does have the consequence, which I agree with you, is that it's reduced popular support. And that's one reason why measures like the European basic income for children, seems to me, the kind of thing which the European Union could adopt. There are discussions going on about it. I mean, it's not totally undiscussed. Equally, a European unemployment insurance system. There are several things that could be done which would go a little way to answering the criticism that the Union is purely concerned with the internal market and macro policy. But I can't be too encouraging. I mean, I think I share many of your doubts.
Die nächste Frage bitte, die kann auch auf Deutsch gestellt sein. Das ist
ja, sicher. Ja.
Da hinten hatte sich jemand gemeldet, genau.
Ortrud Lessmann, Internationales Forschungszentrum Salzburg. Toni, wir kennen uns von der Human Development and Capability Association. Und von daher hat es mich ein bisschen gewundert, dass du in deinem Buch doch sehr stark dich konzentrierst eben auf das Einkommen und Vermögen und eben nach wie vor die monetäre Messung und nicht etwas stärker in die Richtung gehst, die der Capability-Ansatz eigentlich nahelegt, nämlich eine multidimensionale Messung von Armut und Ungleichheit. Ja, da hätte ich gerne einen Kommentar dazu.
Yeah, that's so nice to see you again. Yes, indeed, it's a fair point. I debated about that, and I decided I wanted to address, as it were, the issue as it was being typically presented, but with an underpinning. As you will have seen, in explaining the reasons why I was concerned about inequality, there was a discussion about the capability approach. But I felt that I was trying to concentrate on the issues that they present themselves very much in the public debate, rather than to try and persuade people to think about those particular aspects in a different way. But I agree that there certainly could be, and I think that the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, are providing a basis for a wider discussion. I wasn't trying to cover, in that sense, the whole waterfront. And I gather that I heard from Sabina Alkir the other day that there's a multi-dimensional measure which is being adopted as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. I should also say that I'm currently engaged chairing a group for the World Bank on the measurement of global poverty, which will be very much concerned with going beyond dollars per day. But I think your point is a fair one. I was writing a book which I had to finish in 3 months. There are many things I would have tried to say.
Da vorne, genau. Ja.
Yeah, Matthias Wuttig, Aachen University. I'm curious about, you make a strong point about unhealthy inequalities, but I'm also wondering which level of inequality would be beneficial. So which small number? And when is inequality really catastrophic? When does the system fail?
That's a very good question. The first half of it, I said to at the beginning, I'm not trying to answer that question, in the sense that I was it was premised on the view that the current levels of inequality, certainly in the United Kingdom and the United States, are excessive, particularly, I think, the persistence of financial poverty. But I wasn't going to say we should get down to X percent, because that's a very interesting but different debate. I was simply saying, suppose you want to move in that direction. The other way is, I agree, is a very interesting question, which I don't really know the answer. Well, I don't know the answer to the other one either, but how far societies can survive. Clearly, the South African case is special in a number of respects. We've seen in Latin America that really quite high levels of inequality have been, it's hard to say causally, but nonetheless, it's striking that so many Latin American countries have taken action in the last 10 years or so to reduce inequality from very high levels. So if there's any causal relation, which I said is rather hard to establish, that may suggest that they were running at levels which were not sustainable politically there. But I think your question is good, my answer is not very good.
Ja, gab es da noch einen? Ja.
Mein Name ist Viktor Steinberger. Ich bin gewerkschaftlicher Berater, Trade Unionist. Vielleicht ein Aspekt. Ich bin viel in Unternehmen unterwegs und erlebe zurzeit in Deutschland, in der Region, in der ich aktiv bin, eine Entwicklung der Generationenabfolge in den Unternehmen. Es tritt eine junge Generation von neuen Eignern an, deren Bewusstsein sehr stark seit diesem Hochgehen der Kurven, wie du es gezeigt hast, Timothy, in den Thatcher-Jahren geprägt ist. Und die betrachten das Eigentum als Privateigentum und den sozialen Aspekt, den blenden sie vollständig aus. Das Problem ist, dass ich immer häufiger auch bei den Beschäftigten auf ein vergleichbares Bewusstsein treffe. Die Beschäftigten, die in Situationen, wo wir solche Dinge in Frage stellen, die Antwort geben, würde ich der Eigentümer sein, dann würde ich es doch genauso machen. Ja? Also ich spreche an das Problem der Formierung des Bewusstseins. Ja. Und das hat sicher etwas mit Murdoch zu tun in Großbritannien. Das hat sicher auch was mit einer Medienlandschaft zu tun. So. Das heißt, die Frage der Verteilung ist aus meiner Sicht auch eine Frage der Prägung des Bewusstseins. Mhm. Und das wiederum hängt in meiner kleinen Welt sehr stark zusammen mit der Prägung des Bewusstseins durch Meinungsindustrie im Privatbesitz.
Ja. Yes. Mm. Well, I agree with much of what you said. And in fact, as I said at the beginning, one of the reasons, yes, I think I said at the beginning, yes, one of the reasons why I wrote the book was to try, as it were, to expand people's horizons and to change the agenda, which of course is very much determined by what I would loosely refer to as the media, which I think then has done much to form people's attitudes and opinions. I think that is a real problem. I think that as I said, one thing academics can do is to not feel those constraints and to explore alternatives and to bring them to general notice. I think you're right in saying that there's probably a generational effect. I've been struck, I've been talking about this book, probably it's about the 25th or 30th time I've given talks about the book. And the audience is usually bimodal in age. Now, of course, it's hard to separate that out from the fact that people in the middle, as it were, are very busy looking after children and other things, so they can't come to meetings and evenings and so on. But nonetheless, I do think that there is an interesting fact that at the other end, the not yet owners of firms and managers and so on, there's actually a lot of interest, certainly in the UK, but also elsewhere, in the younger generation who have been perhaps less influenced by the Thatcherite Reagan generation. So it may be there are swings again, and that may change. Certainly, I'm amazed that the students will organise a meeting, which is not usually terribly well organised, and so on, and they'll get 200 or 300 students turn up to hear about the book and so on, and that's I think is quite one reason I'm more optimistic than I would otherwise be. But no, I agree. I think these things are deep-seated, and indeed, I think in the United States there's much more hard empirical evidence about the role of media ownership, for example, and the impact that has, well, clearly through campaign financing, but also through controlling the agenda.
Ich würde eine letzte Frage,
Yeah.
Entschuldigung, sorry.
No.
Eine letzte Frage noch und dann würden wir uns so langsam in die Kaffeepause begeben und können auch noch weiter diskutieren.
Hello, my name is Helge Döring. Do you see any chance of a decrease of inequality in the UK under current Tory reign with Mr. Cameron, or are there higher hopes on Mr. Jeremy Corbyn to do this? And could there be a comeback of the Attlee taxation, where high incomes are really under high taxation, like 90% above 1 million income, maybe?
I think I can fairly safely say we won't have taxes of 90%. Nor would I be in favour of them. I mean, in my discussion of taxation, I take a rather different view from most economists who say, well, it's all about incentives and whether you have high tax rates, people will work less and so on. I don't think, particularly at the top end of the scale, I'm unimpressed by the argument that incentives are what dominate. As one executive said recently, he said, if I was paid twice as much, I wouldn't work any harder. And if I was paid half what I was paid, I wouldn't work any less. So I think it's not a question of incentive. It's a question, I think, the top tax rates, or tax rates in general, are a question of, I think, of fairness. And I think that's something that's missing from the economist analysis. And that's what most people, if you ask them in the street, they think 90% is unfair. That actually, if people are very successful, or if they work hard, they should be allowed to keep more than 10%. On the other hand, how much more they should be allowed to keep, we can discuss. And I think in the book I suggest a rate of 65% at the top, because that's actually the rate which the government, the Conservative government, operate for people on income-tested benefits. They say you can keep 35% of your extra income. So I say what's fair for the bottom 20-30% should be, we should play the same fairness consideration higher up. Whether, well, on the politics, I'll just mention, well, anecdotally, a friend of mine who's quite wealthy, he bought a copy of my book and sent it to every member of Parliament. I'm sorry, not the same copy. He bought 650 copies and sent them to each of the newly elected members of Parliament, which actually turns out rather difficult to do, because you can't just arrive at the House of Commons with a large box. People are suspicious of large boxes going in. Ever since Guy Fawkes tried to burn down the Houses of Commons. So you have to, he had quite a hard job, because he had to go get them individually checked and everything and so on. Anyway, the first person to respond to that was a Conservative member of Parliament, who invited me to lunch to talk about it. So, it wasn't a Labour member of Parliament. But I have since had inquiries, and of course George Osborne's actually already introduced the raising the minimum wage, and that's already Conservative party policy. Nothing else so far, but I think there are certain areas. For example, I mean, this becomes rather peculiarly British. So, one of the things I argued was we should have something which you've had very effectively over a longish period, which goes back to the issue of employers and workers, some form of socio and economic council. There is at the moment no forum where we can have a public discussion of these issues in Britain. And I think this should be not like necessarily, say, the Dutch system, which is very good, but was designed in a post-war world and so on probably. And some countries have revised their socio and economic council. One's abolished it. Italy has abolished its socio-economic council. So I think we should think about a 21st century version of it, which would involve, for example, non-governmental organizations and not only employers and unions, but and involve other representations of civil society. But there should be somewhere we could talk about precisely the kind of questions that we've been raising here, the kind of discussion you'll have later on. So I think that is a move, and that's something which has certainly attracted interest from the opposition party.
Okay, also vielen Dank für die Diskussion. Vielen Dank an Sie, Herr Atkinson.